Hey guys, it's asmrbebexo. Today I'm going to be doing a whispered reading video, like the old days. I'm going to be reading to you a book that I'm currently reading, that I'm really loving, and it is I'm a Strange Loop by Douglas Hofstadter. I've talked about this book in previous videos, I think in like a library roleplay or something. I almost read Hatchet to you today because a lot of people request Hatchet, but I wanted to read something a little more intellectual, which I really enjoy doing. This is a philosophy book. It might be a little far-fetched for some people, like you might not know what the hell he's talking about the whole time if you're not into this sort of thing. But if you enjoy reading about thought-provoking subjects and just mind-boggling things, I really like having like really deep conversations and learning new things and thinking about complex subjects. So I really like this book. It kind of is an analysis of the conscious mind, or the sense of self or I. So I'm just going to read to you the first chapter probably. And if y'all like it, I can read more to you in the future, or I recommend that you go pick this up and read it because it's pretty cool. I'm wearing this really weird shirt today that I bought in Cozumel when I was really drunk. I don't really like it, but these sleeves have these nice tingly beaded tassel things. So I thought as I move around it might add some nice sound effects to the video. It also has them at the bottom. I'll show you. It just says Cozumel, Mexico. It's really tassely and weird, but not really 100% my style. I don't know why I bought it, but anyways, I like the sunflower. But anyways, I'm gonna skip like the introduction or the preface and the prologue. In the preface, he just talks about what inspired him to write this book, kind of some of his life experience, what he's been through, and what brought him to write this book. It also talks about his extensive use of metaphors in this book, which he uses to help make his subject matter a little more relatable. And because of his use of metaphors, the book does become a little easier to read and understand. It brings up some really nice subjects that I think everyone should think about our human existence. I did highlight one sentence out of his preface and that I liked, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, "I don't think one can truly prove anything in philosophy. I think one can merely try to convince, and probably one will wind up convincing only those people who started out fairly close to the position one is advocating." So it just kind of points out to go into this with an open mind. And if you haven't ever delved into these types of subjects before, you might not relate, but I think you should still try. And then his prologue is this weird kind of dialogue that he wrote between Plato and Socrates. And it wasn't a real dialogue that these two philosophers had. It's more of a pretend dialogue that he, the author, wrote out to kind of introduce the subject matter in the book. It's a little weird to read, you know, going back saying Plato, Socrates, so I'm going to skip that, but it's kind of interesting. Where I'm going to start is chapter 1. There's this nice little picture of these giraffes. There's a lot of nice pictures in this book, actually. There's actually some colored photos in the middle that show some trippy stuff. If you like that, it's really cool. But anyways, I'm I'm going to read to you chapter 1. I'm going to be whispered reading. This is called On Souls and Their Sizes. So here we go. There are miniature subtitles, so I'll read those to you as well. Soul Shards. One gloomy day in early 1991, a couple of months after my father died, I was standing at the kitchen of my parents' house, and my mother, looking at a sweet and touching photograph of my father taken perhaps 15 years earlier, said to me with a note of despair, "What meaning does that photograph have?" "None at all. It's just a flat piece of paper with dark spots on it here and there. It's useless." The bleakness of my mother's grief-drenched remarks set my head spinning, because I knew instinctively that I disagreed with her, but I did not quite know how to express to her the way I felt the photograph should be considered. After a few minutes of emotional pondering, soul-searching, quite literally, I hit upon an analogy that I felt could convey to my mother my point of view, and which I hoped might lend her at least a tiny degree of consolation. What I said to her was along the following lines. In the living room, we have a book of the Chopin Etudes for piano. All of its pages are just pieces of paper with dark marks on them, just as two-dimensional and flat and foldable as the photograph of Dad. And yet, think of the powerful effect that they have had on people all over the world for 150 years now. Thanks to those black marks on those flat sheets of paper, untold thousands of people have collectively spent millions of hours moving their fingers over the keyboards of pianos in complicated patterns, producing sounds that give them indescribable pleasure and a sense of great meaning. Those pianists in turn have conveyed to many millions of listeners, including you and me, the profound emotions that churned in Frédéric Chopin's heart, thus affording all of us some partial access to Chopin's interiority, to the experience of living in the head, or rather the soul, of Frédéric Chopin. The marks on those sheets of paper are no less than soul shards, scattered remnants of the shattered soul of Frédéric Chopin. Each of those strange geometries of notes has a unique power to bring back to life inside our brains some tiny fragment of the internal experiences of another human being, his sufferings, his joys, his deepest passions and tensions, and we thereby know, at least in part, what it was like to be that human being, and many people feel intense love for him. In just as potent a fashion, looking at that photograph of Dad brings back to us who knew him intimately the clearest memory of his smile and his gentleness, activates inside our living brains some of the most central representations of him that survive in us, makes little fragments of his soul dance again, but in the medium of brains other than his own. Like the score to a Chopin etude, that photograph is a soul shard of someone departed, and it is something that we should cherish as long as we live. Although the above is a bit more flowery than what I said to my mother, it gives the essence of my message. I don't know what effect it had on her feelings about the picture, but that photo is still there on a counter in her kitchen, and every time I look at it, I remember that exchange. I probably will not whisper this whole chapter, as it is a little long, and whispering kind of strains my voice these days. I guess I'm not in practice enough. But I think when I get about halfway through, I'm going to start reading in a soft-spoken voice. So I'll whisper for about the rest of the first half of this chapter. The next subtitle says, What is it like to be a tomato? I slice up and devour tomatoes without the slightest sense of guilt. I do not go to bed uneasily after having consumed a fresh tomato. It does not occur to me to ask myself which tomato I ate, or whether by eating it I have snuffed an inner light, nor do I believe it is meaningful to try to imagine how the tomato felt as it was sitting on my plate being sliced apart. To me, a tomato is a desireless, soulless, non-conscious entity, and I have no qualms about doing with its body as I like. Indeed, a tomato is nothing but its body. There is no mind-body problem for tomatoes. I hope, dear reader, that we agree stopped eating the flesh of mammals. No beef, no ham, no bacon, no spam, no pork, no lamb, no thank you, ma'am. Mind you, I would still enjoy the taste of a BLT or a well-done burger, but for moral reasons, I simply don't partake of them. I don't want to go on a crusade here, but I do need to talk a little bit about my vegetarian leanings because they have everything to do with souls. Guinea pig. When I was 15, I had a summer job punching buttons on a fried-in mechanical calculator in a physiology lab at Stanford University. This was back in those days when there was but one computer on the whole Stanford campus, and few scientists even knew of its existence, let alone thought about using it for their calculations. It was pretty grueling work to do such number punching for hours on end, and one day, Nancy, the graduate student for whose research project I was doing all of this, asked me if, for relief, I'd like to try my hand at other kinds of tasks around the lab. I said sure, and so that afternoon she escorted me up to the 4th floor of the physiology building and showed me the cages where they kept the animals, literally guinea pigs, that they used in their experiments. I still remember the pungent smell and the scurrying about of all those little orange-furred rodents. The next afternoon, Nancy asked me if I would please go up to the top floor and bring down 2 animals for her next round of experiments. I didn't have a chance to reply, however, for no sooner had I started to imagine myself reaching into one of those cages and selecting 2 small, soft, furry beings to be snuffed than my head began spinning, and in a flash I fainted right away, banging my head on the concrete floor. The next thing I knew, I was looking up into the face of the lab's director, George Feigen, a dear old family friend who was deeply concerned that I might have injured myself in the fall. Luckily, I was fine, and I slowly stood up and then rode my bike home for the rest of the day. Nobody ever asked me again to pick animals to be sacrificed for the sake of science. Pig. Oddly enough, despite that extremely troubling head-on encounter with the concept of taking the life of a living creature, I kept on eating hamburgers and other kinds of meat for several years. I don't think I thought about it very much since none of my friends did, and certainly no one talked about it. Meat eating was just a background fact in the life of everyone I knew. Moreover, I admit with shame that in my mind, back in those days, the word vegetarian conjured up an image of weird, sternly moralistic nutcases. The movie The 7-Year Itch has a terrific scene in a vegetarian restaurant in Manhattan that conveys this stereotype to a T. But one day when I was 21, I read a short story called Pig by the Norwegian English writer Roald Dahl, and this story had a profound effect on my life, and through me on the lives of other creatures as well. Pig starts off lightly and amusingly. A naive young man named Lexington, raised as a strict vegetarian by his aunt Glosspan, Pangloss reversed, discovers after her death that he loves the taste of meat, though he doesn't know what it is that he's eating. Soon, recently, to my great pleasure, a web search yielded hints that Einstein's sympathies were, in fact, toward vegetarianism, and not for health reasons, but out of compassion towards living beings. But I didn't know that back then, and in any case, many other heroes of mine were certainly carnivores who knew exactly what they were doing. Such facts saddened and confused me. Reversion and re-evolution. The very strange thing is that only a few years later, I too found my pressures of daily life in American society so strong that I gave up on my once passionate vegetarianism, and for a while all my intense ruminations went totally underground. I think that the me of the mid-60s would have found this reversal totally unfathomable, and yet the two versions of me had both lived in the very same skull. Was I really the same person? Several years passed this way, almost as if I had never had any epiphany, but then one day when I was a beginning assistant professor at Indiana University, I met a highly thoughtful woman who had adopted the same vegetarian philosophy as I once had, and had done so for similar reasons, but she had stuck to it for a longer time than I had. Sue and I became good friends, and I admired the purity of her stance. Our friendship caused me to think it all through once more, and in short order I had swum back to my post-pig stance of no killing at all. Over the next several years there came a few more oscillations, but by my late 30s I had finally settled into a stable state, a compromise representing my evolving intuition that there are souls of different sizes. Though it was anything but crystal clear to me, I was willing to accept the vague idea that some souls, provided they were small enough, could legitimately be sacrificed for the sake of the desires of larger souls, such as mine and those of other human beings. Although drawing the dividing line at mammals was clearly somewhat arbitrary, as any such dividing line must be, that became my new credo, and I stuck with it for 2 more decades. The mystery of inanimate flesh. We English speakers do not eat pig or cow. We eat pork and beef. We do eat chicken, but we don't eat chickens. One time, the very young daughter of a friend of mine exclaimed with great mirth to her father that the word for a certain farm bird that clucks and lays eggs was also the word for a substance that she often found on her plate at dinner time. She found this a most humorous coincidence, similar to the humorous coincidence that calf means both a young cow and a part of one's leg. She was upset, needless to say, when she was told that the tasty food stuff and the clucky egg layer were one and the same thing. Presumably we all go through much the same confusion when, as children, we discover we are eating animals that our culture tells us are cute. Lambs, bunnies, calves, chicks, and so forth. I remember, albeit dimly, my own genuine childhood confusion at this mystery, but since meat eating was such a bland commonplace, I usually swept it under the rug and didn't give it much thought. Nonetheless, grocery stores had an annoying way of bringing the issue up very vividly. There were big display cases with all sorts of slimy-looking blobs of various strange colors, labeled liver, tripe, heart, and kidney, and sometimes even tongue and brain. Not only did these sound like animal parts, they looked like them as well. Fortunately, what was called ground beef didn't look terribly much like an animal part, and I say fortunately because it tasted so good. Wouldn't want to be talked out of that. Bacon tasted great too, and strips of the stuff were so thin and, once cooked, so crunchy that they hardly conjured up thoughts of an animal at all. How fortunate. It was the unloading docks at the rear of grocery stores that made the mystery come back with a vengeance. Sometimes a big truck would pull up, and when its rear doors swung open, I would see huge chunks of flesh and bones dangling lifelessly on scary-looking metal hooks. I would watch with morbid curiosity as these carcasses were carried into the back of the store and attached to hooks that slid along overhead rails so that they could be moved around easily. All this made the pre-adolescent me very uneasy, and as I gazed at a carcass I could not help musing, who was that animal? I wasn't wondering about its name, because I knew that farm animals didn't have names. I was grasping at something more philosophical, how it had felt to be that animal as opposed to some other one. What was the unique inner light that had suddenly gone off when this animal had been slaughtered? When I went to Europe as a teenager, the issue was raised more starkly. There, lifeless animal bodies, usually skinned, headless and tailless, but sometimes not, were on display in front of all customers. My most vivid recollection is of frozen on his face, and that gave me the creeps. Once again, I couldn't help wondering who once had been in that head, who had lived there, who had looked out through those eyes, heard through those ears. Who had this hunk of flesh really been? Was it a male or a female? No answers came, of course, and no other customers seemed to pay any attention to this display. It seemed to me that nobody else was facing the intense questions of life, death, and personal identity that this silent, still head provoked so powerfully and agitatedly inside mine. I sometimes asked myself the analogous question if I squished an ant or clothes, moth or mosquito, but not so often. My instinct told me that there was less meaning to the question, who is in there, in such cases. Nonetheless, the sight of a partly squished insect writhing around on the floor would always give rise to some soul-searching. And indeed, the reason I have raised all these grim images is not in order to crusade for a cause to which probably most of my readers have already given considerable thought. It is rather to raise the burning issue of what a soul is and who or what possesses one. It is an issue that concerns everyone throughout their life, implicitly at the very least, and for many people quite explicitly, and it is the core issue of this book. And this is where the subject matter gets a little lighter and kind of goes more into souls and more human existence. So I'm going to start speaking softly rather than whispering because my voice feels quite strained. And I want to finish the chapter. So, the next subtitle says, Give me some men who are stouter-souled men. I alluded earlier to my deep love for the music of Chopin. In my teens and 20s, I played a lot of Chopin on the piano, often out of the bright yellow editions published by G. Schirmer in New York City. Each of those volumes opened with an essay penned in the early 1900s by the American critic James Huneker. Today, many people would find Huneker's prose overblown, but I did not. Its unrestrained emotionality resonated with my perception of Chopin's music, and I still love his style of writing and his rich metaphors. In his preface to the volume of Chopin's Etudes, Huneker asserts of the 11th Etude in Opus 25 in A minor, a titanic outburst often called the Winter Wind, though that was certainly neither Chopin's title nor his image for it, the following striking thought: small-souled men, no matter how agile their fingers, should not attempt it. I personally can attest to the terrifying technical difficulty of this incredible, surging piece of music, having valiantly attempted to learn it when I was around 16 and having sadly been forced to give it up in midstream, since playing just the first page up to speed, which I finally managed to do after several weeks of unbelievably arduous practice, made my right hand throb with pain. But the technical difficulty is of course not what Huneker was referring to. Quite rightly, he is saying that the piece is majestic and noble, but more controversially, he is drawing a dividing line between different levels or sizes of human souls, suggesting that some people are simply not up to playing this piece, not because of any physical limitations of their bodies, but because their souls are not large enough. I won't bother to criticize the sexism of Huneker's words. That was par for the course in those days. This kind of sentiment does not go down well in today's egalitarian America. It would not play in Peoria. Quite frankly, it rings terribly elitist, perhaps even repugnant to our modern democratic ears. And yet I have to admit that I somewhat agree with Huneker, and I can't help wondering if we don't all of us implicitly believe in the validity of something vaguely like the idea of small-souled and large-souled human beings. In fact, I can't help suggesting that this is indeed the belief of almost all of us, no matter how egalitarian we publicly profess to be. Small-souled and large-souled humans. Some of us believe in capital punishment, the intentional public squelching of a human soul, no matter how ardently that soul would plead for mercy, would tremble, would shake, would shriek, would desperately struggle to escape, on being led down the corridor to the site of their doom. My cats are cutting up. Some of us, perhaps almost all of us, believe that it is legitimate to kill enemy soldiers in a war, as if war were a special circumstance that shrinks the sizes of enemy souls. In earlier days, perhaps some of us would have believed, as did George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, each in their own way, at least for some period of time, that it was not immoral to own slaves and to buy and sell them, breaking up families willy-nilly, just as we do today with, for example, horses, dogs, and cats. Some religious people believe that atheists, agnostics, and followers of other faiths, and worst of all, traitors who have abandoned the faith, have no souls at all and are therefore eminently deserving of death. Some people, including some women, believe that women have no souls, or perhaps a little more generously that women have smaller souls than men do. Some of us, myself included, believe that the late President Reagan was essentially all gone many years before his body gave up the ghost. And more generally, we believe that people in the final stages of Alzheimer's disease are essentially all gone. It strikes us that although there is a human brain couched inside each of those cranial shells, something has gone away from that brain, something essential, something that contains the secrets of that person's soul. The I has either wholly or partly vanished, gone down the drain, never to be found again. Some of us, again I count myself in this group, believe that neither a just fertilized egg nor a 5-month-old fetus possesses a full human soul, and that in some sense a potential mother's life counts more than the life of that small creature, alive though it indisputably is. Hattie the Chocolate Labrador. Kelly. After brunch we're going out to see Lynn's turkey, which we haven't seen yet. Doug. Which or whom? Kelly. Which, I'd say. A turkey is not a whom. Doug. I see. So is Hattie a whom or a which? Kelly. Oh, she's a whom, no doubt. Ollie the Golden Retriever. Doug. So how did Ollie enjoy the outing this afternoon at Lake Griffey? Danny. Oh, he had a pretty good time, but he didn't play much with the other dogs. He liked playing with the people, though. Doug. Really? How come? Danny. Ollie's a people person. Where to draw that fateful, fatal line? All human beings, at least all sufficiently large-souled ones, have to make up their minds about such matters as the swatting of mosquitoes or flies, the setting of mousetraps, the eating of rabbits or lobsters or turkeys or pigs, perhaps even of dogs or horses, the purchase of mink stoles or ivory statues, the usage of leather suitcases or crocodile belts, even the penicillin-based attack on swarms of bacteria that have invaded their body, and on and on. The world imposes large and small moral dilemmas on us all the time, at the very least meal after meal, and we are all forced to take a stand. Does a baby lamb have a soul that matters, or is the taste of lamb chops just too delicious to worry one's head over? Does a trout that went for the bait and is now helplessly thrashing about on the end of a nylon line deserve to survive? Or should it just be given one sharp thwack on the head and put out of its misery, so that we can savor the indescribable and yet strangely predictable soft, flaky texture of its white muscles? Do grasshoppers and mosquitoes and even bacteria have a tiny little light on inside, no matter how dim, or is it all dark in there? In where? Why do I not eat dogs? Who was the pig whose bacon I am enjoying for breakfast? Which tomato is it that I am munching on? Should we chop down that magnificent elm in our front yard? And while I'm at it, shall I yank out the wild blackberry bush and all the weeds growing right by it? What gives us word users the right to make life and death decisions concerning other living creatures that have no words? Why do we find ourselves in positions of such anguish, at least for some of us? In the final analysis, it is simply because might makes right. And we humans, thanks to the intelligence afforded us by the complexity of our brains and our embeddedness in rich languages and cultures, are indeed high and mighty, relative to the lower animals and vegetables. By virtue of our might, we are forced to establish some sort of ranking of creatures, whether we do so as a result of long and careful personal reflections or simply go along with the compelling flow of the masses. Are cows just as comfortably killable as mosquitoes? Would you feel any less troubled by swatting a fly preening on a wall than by beheading a chicken quivering on a block? Obviously, such questions can be endlessly proliferated. Note the ironic spelling of this verb, pro-life. But I will not do so here. Below I have inserted my own personal consciousness cone. It is not meant to be exact, it is merely suggestive. But I submit that some comparable structure exists inside your head, as well in the head of each language-endowed human being, although in most cases it is seldom, if ever, subjected to intense scrutiny because it is not even explicitly formulated. So as we can see, he made this cone. These at the top are obviously larger, and they get very small at the bottom. So at the top we have lots of consciousness, in the middle we have less but some consciousness, and at the bottom we have little to no consciousness. So you can see he's ordered it as normal adult humans at the top. Then we have mentally retarded, brain damaged, and senile humans. Then we have dogs, bunnies, chickens, goldfish, bees, mosquitoes, mites, microbes, viruses, and atoms. Interiority. What has it, and to what degree? It is most likely that you, a reader of this book, have missed all the Star Wars movies with their rather unforgettable characters C-3PO and R2-D2. Absurdly unrealistic though these two robots are, especially as perceived by someone like myself who has worked for decades trying to understand just the most primordial mechanisms of human intelligence by building computational models thereof, they nonetheless serve one very useful purpose. They are mind openers. Seeing C-3PO and R2-D2 in flesh and blood on the screen makes us realize that whenever we look at an entity made of metal or plastic, we're not inherently destined to jump reflexively to the dogmatic conclusion that thing is necessarily an inanimate object since it is made of the wrong stuff. Rather, we find, perhaps to our own surprise, that we are easily able to imagine a thinking, feeling entity made of cold, rigid, unflesh-like stuff. In one of the Star Wars films, I recall seeing a huge squadron of hundreds of uniformly marching robots. When I say uniformly, I mean really uniformly, with all of them strutting in perfect synchrony, and all of them featuring identical, impassive, vacuous, mechanical facial expressions. I suspect that thanks to this unmistakable image of absolute interchangeability, virtually no viewer feels the slightest twinge of sadness when a bomb falls on the charging platoon and all of its members, these factory-made creatures, are instantly blown to smithereens. After all, in diametric opposition to C-3PO and R2-D2, these robots are not creatures at all. They are just hunks of metal. There's no more interiority to these metallic shells than there is to a can opener or a car or a battleship, a fact revealed to us by their perfect identicality. Or else, if perchance there is inside of them some tiny degree of interiority, it is on the same order as the interiority of an ant. These metallic marchers are mere soldier robots, members of a drone-like caste in some larger robot colony, and are merely following out in their zombie-ish way the inflexible mechanical drives implanted in their circuitry. If there is interiority somewhere in there, it is of a negligible level. What is it then that gives us the undeniable sense that C-3PO and R2-D2 have a light on inside, that there is lots of genuine interiority inside their inorganic crania, located somewhere behind their funny circular eyes? Where does our undeniable sense of their eyes come from? And contrariwise, what is it that was lacking in former President Reagan in his last years and in that mass of identical blown-up soldier robots? And what is it that is not lacking in Hattie the Chocolate Labrador and in R2-D2 the robot that makes all the difference to us? The gradual growth of a soul. I stated above that I am among those who reject the notion that a full-fledged human soul comes into being the moment that a human sperm joins a human ovum to form a human zygote. By contrast, I believe that a human soul, and by the way, it is my aim in this book to make clear what I mean by this slippery, shifting word, often rife with religious connotations, but here not having any, comes slowly into being over the course of years of development. It may sound crass to put it this way, but I would like to suggest, at least metaphorically, a numerical scale of degrees of souledness. We can initially imagine it as running from 0 to 100, and the units of this scale can be called, just for the fun of it, hunicers. Thus, you and I, dear reader, both possess 100 hunicers of souledness, or thereabouts. Shake. Oops, I just realized that I have committed an error that comes from long years of indoctrination into the admirable egalitarian traditions of my native land. Namely, I unconsciously assumed that there is a value at which souledness maxes out, and that all normal adults reach that ceiling and can go no higher. Why, though, should I make any such assumption? Why could souledness not be like tallness? There is an average tallness for adults, but there is also a considerable spread around that average. Why should there not likewise be an average degree of solidness for adults, 100 hunikers say, plus a wide range around that average? Maybe, as for IQ, going as high as 150 or 200 hunikers in rare cases, and down to 50 or lower in others. If that's how things are, then I retract my reflexive claim that you and I, dear readers, share 100 hunikers of solidness. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we both have considerably higher readings than that on the hunicometer. I hope you agree. However, this is starting to feel like a dangerous moral territory, verging on the suggestion that some people are worth more than others, a thought that is anathema in our society and which troubles me as well. So I won't spend much time here trying to figure out how to calculate a person's solidness value in hunikers. It strikes me that when sperm joins ovum, the resulting infinitesimal bioblob has a sole value of essentially 0 hunikers. What has happened, however, is that a dynamic, snowballing entity has come into existence that over a period of years will be capable of developing a complex set of internal structures or patterns, and the presence, to a higher and higher degree, of those intricate patterns is what would endow that entity, or rather the enormously more complex entities into which it slowly metamorphoses, step by step, with an even larger value along the huniker soul scale, homing in on a value somewhere in the vicinity of 100. The cone shown on the following page gives a crude but vivid sense of how I might attach huniker values to human beings of ages from 0 to 20, or alternatively to just one human being, but at different stages. So here, you can see, he has the letter I in different capitalizations and smaller, and at the top he has age 20 down to 0. So he's saying you can max out around age 20, and at younger ages your soul is of a smaller size. In short, I would here argue, echoing and generalizing the provocative statement by James Huniker, that solidness is by no means an off-on, black-white, discrete variable having just 2 possible states like a bit, a pixel, or a light bulb, but rather is a shaded, blurry, numerical variable that ranges continuously across different species and varieties of object, and that also can rise or fall over time as a result of the growth or decay within the entity in question of a special kind of subtle pattern, the elucidation of whose nature will keep us busy for much of this book. I would also argue that most people's largely unconscious prejudices about whether to eat or not eat this food or that food, whether to buy or not buy this or that article of clothing, whether to swat or not swat this or that insect, whether to root or not root for this or that species of robot in a sci-fi film, whether to be sad or not be sad if a human character in a film or a novel meets with a violent end, whether to claim or not to claim that a particular senescent person is no longer there, and so forth and so on, reflect precisely this kind of numerical continuum in their minds, whether they admit it or not. You might wonder whether my having drawn a cone that impenitently depicts degrees of solidness during the development of a given human being implies that I would be more willing, if placed under enormous pressure, as in the film Sophie's Choice, to extinguish the life of a 2-year-old than the life of a 20-year-old adult. The answer is no, it does not. Even though I sincerely believe there is much more of a soul in the 20-year-old than in the 2-year-old, a view that will no doubt dismay many readers, I nonetheless have enormous respect for the potential of the 2-year-old to develop a much larger soul over the course of a dozen or so years. In addition, I have been built by the mechanisms of billions of years of evolution to perceive in the 2-year-old what, for a lack of a better word, I will call cuteness, and the perceived presence of that quality grants the 2-year-old an amazingly strong shell of protectiveness against attacks not just by me, but by humans of all ages, sexes, and persuasions. Lights on? The central aim of this book is to try to pinpoint the nature of that special kind of subtle pattern that I have come to believe underlies or gives rise to what I have here been calling a soul or an I. I could just as well have spoken of having a light on inside, possessing interiority, or that old standby, being conscious. Philosophers of mind often use the terms possessing intentionality, which means having beliefs and desires and fears and so forth, or having semantics, which means the ability to genuinely think about things, as contrasted with the mere ability to juggle meaningless tokens and complicated patterns, a distinction that I raised in the dialogue between my versions of Socrates and Plato in the prologue. Although each of these terms put the focus on a slightly different aspect of the elusive abstraction that concerns us, they are all, from my perspective, pretty much interchangeable. And for all of these terms, I reiterate that they have to be understood as coming in degrees along a sliding scale, rather than as on-off, black-white, or yes and no switches. Postscriptum. The first draft of this chapter was written 2 years ago, and although it discussed meat eating and vegetarianism, it had far less on the topic than this final version does. Some months later, while I was fleshing it out by summarizing the short story Pig, I suddenly found myself questioning the dividing line that I had carefully drawn 2 decades earlier and had lived with ever since, although occasionally somewhat uneasily, namely the line between mammals and other animals. All at once I started feeling distinctly uncomfortable with the idea of eating chicken and fish, even though I had done so for some 20 years, and so, catching myself by surprise, I stopped cold turkey. And by a remarkable coincidence, my 2 children independently came to similar conclusions at almost exactly the same time, so that over a period of just a couple of weeks, our family's diet was transmuted into a completely vegetarian one. I've returned to the same spot as I was in when I was 21 in Sardinia, and it's the spot I plan to stay in. Writing this chapter thus gave rise to a totally unexpected boomerang effect on its author, and as we shall see in later chapters, such an unpredictable bouncing back of choices one has just made, followed by the incorporation of their repercussions into one's self-model, serves as an excellent example of the meaning of the motto, "I am a strange loop." So that was the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called This Teetering Bulb of Dread and Dream, and it discusses topics such as what is a brain structure, a simple analogy between heart and brain, levels and forces in the brain, what shoves what around inside the cranium, thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, thinkodynamics and statistical mentalities. Then we go into chapter 3 on the causal potency of patterns, neurons, dominoes. Basically gets more into the brain, our patterns, what is derived from what. Some of the other chapters, I'll read you the chapter titles. We have After the Causal Potency of Patterns, Loops, Goals, and Loopholes, On Video Feedback, of Selves and Symbols, The Epiphenomenon, Embarking on a Strange Loop Safari, Pattern and Provability, Gödel's Quintessential Strange Loop, How Analogy Makes Meaning, On Downward Causality, The Elusiveness, Apple of My Eye, Strangeness in the Eye of the Beholder, Entwinement, Grappling with the Deepest Mystery, How We Live in Each Other, The Blurry Glow of Human Identity, Consciousness Equals Thinking, A Courteous Crossing of Words, A Brief Brush with Cartesian Egos, A Tango with Zombies and Dualism, Killing a Couple of Sacred Cows, On Magnanimity and Friendship, and The Quandary. So this does get a lot deeper. That was a little introduction. If you think this is something you'd be interested in, definitely check it out. If you want to hear more chapters, let me know. I can try to read some. My throat really hurts now. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope to start putting out at least 1 to 2 videos a week here very soon. And I will see you guys in my next video. Subscribe if you're not already. Bye guys.